So what was this first ideal city of the Renaissance? Where does it come from? Where does it appear? It was invented by an architectural theorist. He was also a sculptor by the name of Filarete. He wrote a treatise on architecture, which was actually never published. It remains in manuscript form, but was hugely influential on his generation and the generations that followed. What he invents here is a fictitious city. And what you're looking at, in fact, is a page from that treatise describing the contours of his city. It's an 8-pointed star. There's the principle of 8 again, enclosed in a circle. The fact that we have an 8-pointed star makes clear that he's recuperating the Vitruvian objection to the 8 prevailing winds and the idea of the hygienic city, which is counteracted in this case by streets and canals, which alternate, he tells us in the text. The circles in the drawing are defensive towers. The context for this, or the context for the treatise here, is the fact that at this moment in the 1460s, Filarete was actually in the employ of the Duke of Milan, a man by the name of Francesco Sforza, therefore the name of the city, Sforzinda. And the fiction here, which is described in the treatise, is that Filarete's patron, the Duke of Milan, has asked him to design a city, to imagine a new city with a name that honors him. So Sforzinda here is described in plan and described in terms of institutions, in terms of materials that are necessary, and in terms of the general organization of the city. What's curious about the treatise is that it doesn't proceed in terms of principles, in terms of ideas, in terms of the orders, but rather it unfolds as a fiction, much like More's own novel. It relates that as the construction of the city port of this Sforzinda began, a kind of archaeological discovery was made. A golden book is unearthed, which described an ancient mythical city. This is what we call a kind of mise en abîme, or a kind of fictional ploy, a book in a book. And this mythical city, of course, becomes in turn the model for the planning of Filarete's Sforzinda. What Filarete essentially was doing was emulating the ancients, inventing an ancient authority with which to legitimate his own design. And this is where the key role of illustration, of the image, emerges in a textual context. In other words, again, this exchange between words and images, or architecture's relationship to language and its own visual codes. So the images here become a way to carry or illustrate the principles. Here we see clearly the triumph of the kind of diagrammatic imagination that ultimately Ledoux will carry forward in his City of Show. Sforzinda is composed of a walled circle, which encloses intersecting quadrangles at its center. You'll see that in one of the illustrations, it's actually hovering in like an abstract shape over this undulating landscape. So it's clear that the plan, highly geometric, isn't actually integrated into the topography. It then reappears as a second, larger, more geometrically determined form, an abstract diagram with a double circumference. And finally, we come to the most authoritative plate, the most detailed illustration, which is most like a city plan. Here, you have 2 squares which create a star, and if you look closely at the drawing, you can see the pencil lines, which will then be emphasized in ink. The star is emphasized and enclosed in a circle. Both the circle and the star are forcefully delineated. The wall of the city is in fact that star shape, and it follows a pattern that touches the circle, which is a moat. The text describes how canals and streets converge on the city center, but actually this part is not made explicit in the plan. What we do see, however, at the center of the star is the beginning of a city fabric. So here, a kind of multifocal city planning is just beginning to show inside this abstract diagram. So think of this as a kind of encounter between ideal geometries and the beginnings of thinking through how institutions will find their place in the city fabric. It's worth mentioning here that Vitruvius was not the only source, however, for this kind of abstraction or diagrammatic imagination. The idea of enclosing the city in a circle is also interestingly based on the medieval image of the world and the universe. The ideal city here is automatically compared to the shape of the cosmos, and you have the pretense of the architect alluding to the cosmos or having some kind of cosmological intention for the design of his city. Let's think a little bit more about the shape of Sforzinda and the kind of planning that it's beginning to suggest. We see the moat in the circle. We see the angular wall of the ramparts with their angular circuit. We see one circular ring street and then the central core. That central core is actually following the ancient Roman model of the public forum or the public market, which is a central square and marks the kind of center of business, judicial affairs, power, and also spiritual authority. In the text, Filarete describes the kind of grandeur of this public space. He describes colonnades and that the fact that the main thoroughfares are going to lead from that central space to the outlying city districts. In other words, he's beginning to develop for the first time a kind of notion of ordered and triumphant public space. But if we focus in on the layout of the center, we'll see that he's actually incorporating three squares. There's the central one, which is the main piazza, and then just to the north and to the south are smaller squares. If you look at the organization, you'll see a Greek cross set in a square. That is a sure signal that this is where the church is, a central planned church. Opposite the church, on the other end, is the prince's palace. On the southern end, we have the kind of activity of the market, we have a bank, we have merchants, and to the north, we have judicial authority. So there's a very clear symbolic marking in this central square of the kinds of institutions that make up a society: spiritual, political, economic, and judicial. This is the germinating idea of what will ultimately be called multifocal urban planning in the modern city. This insertion of institutions in the fabric of the city is remarkable and to be noted. Not only does Filarete's city include a palace, many churches, a hall of justice, and banks, he also envisioned separate schools for boys and girls, which was very forward-looking. He was also interested in the perfection of the citizenry and says so in his text, which is why he comes up with what you see here, a house of vice and virtue. I want to point out formally that this drawing is strange. It is an attempt at perspective. It's not in any way systematic or precise or mathematically determined, but instead an approximation. But what's so curious about it is the way it combines and confuses multiple visual conventions. If you look at the ground floor, you see the line of plan traced out as a circle. If you look at the side wings, you'll see that he's actually cut through the building and is showing a section. And then the bulge of the tower, perspectival, not properly orthographic, is of course an attempt at perspectival elevation in this case. This building is defined by the ring of 10 stories that is mounted on a base and ultimately crowned by a statue of virtue. Again, this emblematization of the importance of the morality of the social body. It functions on the principle of ascension. As you climb up the stairs, you move from the world of the mundane to the world of the intellect and the soul. And you'll find at the top, of course, an astronomical observatory as a way to emphasize that our path through life inevitably will lead from the physical to the intellectual.